what really happened after Dan. Many people loved Blocker as a show star. All of a sudden, his friends remember him as the nice Hoss Cartwright, but he left behind a family with the camera, a secret wealth, and even being left behind, one of his kids, for one of his wives, slowly made his way into Hollywood. Even his co-stars were shocked. What about the beach named after Stay for the truth about how he or she, how much he's worth, because the truth of Dan Blocker is even more shocking and more sad than you think. Let me bring you back to December 10th, 1928. Dandy, Texas, a small, quiet town, easy, but not so quiet when Dan was born. Why? Because she tipped the scales at birth, weighed a huge 14 pounds. The biggest child to ever be born in Bowie County. People in the area joked that Dan didn't crawl, stomped. Dan's early life wasn't too great. An idea for a movie, his parents, Ora, Shaq, Mary, Arizona Blocker, and John Blocker were normal people trying to make it through the rough winds of the Great Depression. Blue Shack guy lost everything when the market crashed and opened a small food store to get it. But this is where it is interesting that Dan spent most of his as a child bringing groceries and stocking shelves. But because of his size, let's just say he wasn't really made for. His dad would joke that it was hard work, that he might have to pay people to take Dan off of his back because he was having more cans fall over than he was stacked. But hey, that would be the same problem one day. Give him a name that everyone knows. To jump ahead in time and find Greg when Dan hit 13 and began at the Texas military. From this point on, he was already a rock of a kid and got a spot as a tackle for the football team, and sure, it was enough football to pay for his schooling, where he went to Sul Ross State University. I had planned to become an English teacher. Soon to be TV. Cowboy first wanted a quiet grades that make life better on all but one piece of workday that the theater area had to have. A strong enough to move the Big Dan is the only one who would move the play's props around. But wait, he did more than just that. He was moving things around behind the scenes, who was in the show, and what did the Big A man fell in love with a woman who wasn't yet with the laughs, with the stage itself, and cheered when he moved to the right. He quit football for footlights and went away. English just for fun, and never went back life after high school through another. It was a surprise call to service during the Korean War, and Dan said, "I'm proud to serve." And coming back as a brave soldier, he even had a Purple Heart, and as he washed was tough on the battlefield. But my heart was about to melt while he married the woman he loved, right? Dolph Parker's life after the war. You might be wondering who Dolphia is. Dolphia wasn't the name of a Hollywood actress, was a smart, brave, and strong young man, Oklahoma woman, working behind the parts of the play where she met Dan. Yes, Dan did feel good. When they met for the first time, Goof was getting in the way of a practice, and I had to tell him to quiet down because he was talking too much. With his new wife by his side, Dan was sure he got a master's degree and thought I knew everything. When I went back to school and got my degree I started teaching high school theater, arts English, and theater kids in Texas, and then, in a new fate, pushed him back to his family, moved farther west, and was he after them? Getting him closer to California with a PhD was all. He wasn't interested in playing for fame and a steady job, but Dan needs to pay his bill stride out for parts on TV shows. The Western style was hot, and Dan fit the bill nicely in the 1950s. You could see him show up on hit-watch TV shows like Gunsmoke, The Rifleman, and Maverick. Wasn't a star yet, but he was. In 1958, he finally got close, found a part to play on Cimarron City. The show was short, but don't laugh. The names of those short-lived gigs led to a much bigger thing. Maker David Daughter was making food, start a new show called Bonanza, and someone to play Eric Hoskart the son. The middle cart isn't the best. Tool in the shed, but when it Dan, your heart was pure gold. Did well on the test, and that turned into Hoss. And let me tell you, Hoss, he wasn't just another TV cowboy, the show's heart. But this is Dan. A lot of people don't know this. He had been living that part off screen. Those same warm and friendly traits, kids. That tall frame hides a softy underneath. Believed in him and loved him first. A Bonanza show aired on TV in 1959. It blew up. For 13 years in a row, fans couldn't get enough of the show, only about gunfights and real saloons, things like racism and trust in the family. Dan was there in the middle of doing everything to make sure this scene, it hit home. But Dan didn't run away. He moved his from where he came from. Family and friends to California so they could stay put. He stayed close, the humble guy who used to put things on shelves in his dad's grocery store even after. Having roles in movies with Frank Sinatra like Dan stayed for Lady and Come Blow Your Horn. Bonanza and Cement is true, don't forget that Dan wasn't just taking care of animals. He, Drake, and Dolphia were on the screen. Built a life together by... Now there are 4. Deborah and Dana are twin girls. Her 2 boys, David and Dirk, everyone at home, laughed, loved, and said yes a lot of Dan loved being a favor. Even if it was chaos, meant giving up. He wears a cowboy hat for diapers sometimes. But while Dan took over, he did everything he could in Hollywood too. He could to give his kids an easy life. He didn't want them to grow up. That's why they thought being famous was normal, even though he was becoming more famous. This family moved into a simple 4-bedroom house in Northridge. This is only 20 mi from California. Above all the places where Bonanza was, shot flashy just a 3-bathroom. That's great. A house and a pool. Dan had 4 kids and drove a Corvette. Wild. Kids, it was fine with Stingray, but she stayed with Dolphia, a healthy 1963 Cadillac that didn't have them caught up the shine of Hollywood when we talk about Family Dan's huge 260-pound frame quite often. He became a normal dad, into funny gold that kids would love, as he squeezed their electric setup a course just to test it, or when he was just having fun fighting with them. That's the kind of dad who works in the yard, who was there and have fun you. Never will, big to lie down with his kids. That's the being famous wasn't always easy to understand. Get away from something as simple as going to take the family to get ice cream, become an unexpected get-together offens and hang out with lots of young. Fan-sold people swarmed everywhere he went. He told them he loved them, but behind closed doors that being pulled and being pushed by strangers wasn't his best. He only wanted to see his so that kids can have a normal life. But it was getting harder to find if you read on to find out how Dan is acting. The bugs are so bad that we have to go. Back a little while before all the Dan wore cowboy boots and a hat. It's not the same to go for a life now. Because of Dolphia's, by the end of his, Dan loved being in his 3rd year of college. He changed his major to speech on stage, and by acting in shows, he joined the acting group Mask and Ashes and played parts in plays such as Fumed Oak by Noel Coward, where he played a very funny part as a bad husband. Let's just stand next to Dolly Ash, and they said they didn't have to go too far to play fights between couples on stage. But behind the scenes, where they fell in love, Dan graduated from, in 1950, Hardin Simmons went to college in Asheville, Texas, with a moment to speak. Most guys would want to be here. Do the right thing to make money when you chance to play in Major League Football. Dan, on the other hand, turned off the gridiron, but he agreed to, and it showed early on at one point that he wasn't driven by money or fame, was drawn to do what made his heart rate race after high school. He and his friend Dennis Reed went with his gut and east to join the Summer Stock Theater Company circle. They got things going at the Boston's Brattle Hall Theater, and Dan even got a part in a Broadway show. The play King Lear just as things were stepping up. An unlikely plot uncle, Sam called in a surprise 1950, Dan was forced to join the U.S. Army. Putting off his hopes of becoming an actor, served for 4 tough months at Louisiana's Camp Polk, but even in he couldn't stay away from the uniform on stage. He jumped into an army play about how Macbeth balances practice with drills, but the fun didn't last long. Dan was sent to Japan, then went right into the freezing cold from the bunkers of the Korean War. And this wasn't just a short time. On Christmas Eve, 1951, Dan and his group were trapped on hill by enemy troops 235. For 10 terrible hours, he had to deal with bitter cold gunshots and being worn out. But Dan made it through his time in some way, won him many medals, including the Purple Heart, and on September 23, 1952, after 2 hard years, he was turned away and released 2 days later. Dan, he didn't wait around and married Dolphia right away, in a simple service at noon in There Are No Hollywood Lights in Carlsbad, New Mexico. Nothing but love and a preacher in a small town, a minister named Reverend J. Dando, began their life. Dan and Dyer faced the same thing together. Most young couples have trouble with money. Dan went to Sul Ross State College and finished getting my master's in theater work as a teacher and do the arts to keep putting food on the table first. He taught English and play at a high school in Sonora, Texas, went to Carlsbad, New Spain after that, where sixth graders were not taught anything, not fancy, just hard work, chalk dust, and grades to be given. But deep down, Dan knew that there was still something pulling at me in the middle of the 1950s with Dan saw that his 4 kids and bills were adding up. That lesson wasn't enough to wake up the family. What did he do? This, and did it once more this time. Westerns were a big hit on TV, and Dan's big body and friendly face made a deal fit him, and he began getting parts. Gunsmoke, The Rifleman, and other shows, Will Take a Gun, and Maverick with them. At first it was just small parts, but that against Spark, inside him in 1958, Dan got his big break on City, even though the show had promise. But they pulled out after only 1 season. It hurt at first, but was the best thing that could have happened in the end happen. If they didn't have to work, Dan was picked up just in time to see the director, David Doctor, who was looking for a job, a brand new Western show called Bonanza and the rest. I'm sure you already know this. But believe me, there's more to it than that. That Bonanza didn't go off all at once. The first season was rough, and I had high hopes. But all of a sudden, thanks for taking care of family values, morals, and yes, Dan's great show as host. The show got a lot of attention. Every family in America watched it every day, but Dan wasn't. He was the only player in the band pulse of it, even though Bonanza big hit, but Dan stayed humble. On the side, they did movie roles, seeing Frank Sinatra and Come Blow Your Horn and Putting the Woman in Cement, but he should never let fame get to him. He often looked like he didn't understand everything that was said after that. He didn't pay attention again, figure it out. Why people grabbed him in public as if they knew him well and liked making things held more than the chaos at home. Putting things together as best he could. He spent time with his kids and helped them, having fun and learning from them, showing them that Dad was more than a TV cowboy, loved them both the most. David and his kids saw the show with Dirk. They didn't want to get bizbugs, but by the end, either Dirk became David was a big star himself, but how movies are made behind the scenes, and even won an Emmy for donking only in America. Now this is where Dirk isn't. Something you hear a lot after many years. He was lying about how much he loved. Hurdock used to just tag along with his dad, to the only real way to spend time is on the set. During those busy years, I watched Dan laugh and smile with your co-stars and make these codes work like magic. Dirk got stuck in times like that, so he was sure he wanted to do what his dad told him to do. Did not only on TV, but also in Dan, but he was more than just a great Dad. To be clear, the kind of father he had of guy that everyone on set thought was lucky to work with the cast and crew. Things didn't matter because he had a rare talent for making people feel at ease. Mitch Vogel, who played Jimmy Hunter Cartwright. At the end of his life, a Bonanza said Dan was the nicest person ever, someone you'd want to drink beer with. He was nice and calm after a have a nice day. And trust me, hasn't this always been the case? And that's why when Dan died, it wasn't just down for it shook the whole Bonanza family. Making things, we need tops here back in 1972. TV shows had no idea what to do when a star actor died. It wasn't like today. Which was a surprise. People would be written off, or in special Bonanza episodes they were recognized. Dan's death was more than just sad. Wasn't seen before. Question, how do you keep going without the show's very heart, but you should know this before. Dan had made a big move not long before he passed away in 1971 and was upset and angry about during the Vietnam War he found his family. Switzerland, where he wanted to be quieter and a peaceful life away from politics, there was stress at home, but despite the space, Dan wasn't ready to leave yet. He kept coming back from Bonanza and to Los Angeles to film the movie, balancing life with his family in Europe after leaving Hollywood Hope, and then the spring of music. 72, Dan didn't feel well. He was weak and tired. Getting lost, he went to the hospital, where doctors thought he needed to be surgery on the gallbladder is pretty routine. Process even back then more than 1 million. Taking out the liver or cholecystectomies were already being Done every year in the US, Dan didn't seem to mind. He had the surgery and everything. At first he looked fine. He was getting better, that they were even happy to be free from the gallstones that were getting on his nerves. But then, while Dan was getting better, got an artery embolism all of a sudden, lungs that could have killed him, and he was gone without a word. That kind of second chances on May 13th. Dan Blocker died in 1972. He was 43 years old. Old the cast and company, his family. Everyone was caught off guard. His funeral was small and private. As Dan would have liked, he was put down. He will be buried in Woodman Cemetery in his hometown of Dalb, Texas, buried next to his parents and sister, who was his best friend from the display, Lauren Green, who played Ben Indeed. Cartwright was crushed. Told his wife, "That's it. That's it." He really wasn't finished, though. Wrong without Hoss Bonanza would never be the same. But they tried again. They felt like they owed it to the fans and the cast to finish what they began and moved forward with a final season, but they weren't able to. Don't pay attention to the big problem that's there, Dan. Hoss was no longer there, and I didn't see him. Back then, most shows would brush it. They were brave to let They didn't say how or who's in the sadness show. They made sure no one else saw them die. He was felt in every episode. Michael Landon, who played Little Joe, wrote the first two parts of the season, called Always with Dan in Mind. Landon rewrote the whole thing, turning the attention to because of Little Joe. One of the most painful and emotional episodes of these ever made. Joe falls in love, gets married, looks forward to a child, and then everything in one night to a terrible act of what you saw behind those scenes was violence. Watch on TV is the real pain. That the group wasn't just lying. They were having that experience, and then there was that when Ben and Joe had that amazing moment, went to see the grave of Joe's wife, and baby Ben says in a quiet voice that he know, "Show it feels to lose a son." Wasn't just talking about the person, he was talking about what Hoss said. Find out more about Dan if you pay close attention. Take note that the players weren't just, even though they were acting, they were sad. No matter what they did, the magic was wearing off. Ratings were already going down, but when Dan died, it was like the heart. He had been ripped off of the crazy show. It lost its top Sunday night spot and got moved to Tuesdays at 8 p.m. and made them air it to go up against ABC's hit movie of the week. Viewers went their separate ways. By 1973, the show was canceled for good after great 14-season run, but that's not the end of the story. Felt for a long time after the film stopped moving. In the TV movie Bonanza, the next fans of the generation finally got peace when it came out that Hoss Cartwright had died. A hero falling while trying to help someone else's life wasn't. Very interesting, but it looked like, sure enough, that's what people thought. Dan would have liked it. Dan was putting together a quiet wealth by the time when he died. His net worth was thought to be about $5 million, which is a lot of money for the back in the early 1970s. He made a good purchase by buying several buildings, such a huge 5,000-square-foot home in the fancy Hannock Park in Los Angeles. After years in the neighborhood, the house would infamously owned by a rock star, and the filmmaker Rob Zombie owned the land. In Englewood, more proof that Dank knew how to do more than just act, to make sure the future of his family. And when we talk about legacies, there's one more something about Dan that you most likely don't know. Yes, Blocker Beach is a real beach in the 1970s. One of his best friends, Michael Landon and Lauren Green, bought along. They could have turned to the Malibu coast. They turned it into million-dollar homes, but it was given in honor of Dan. In it was officially named Dan Blocker in 1979. Beach, and it's still there. A wild stretch of sand that waves are running along the shore will always be a memorial to the big guy, who even bigger heart after all these years, Dirk told Dan's kids. Never forget about for him to have a good job, most known for his role as Detective Hitchcock on Brooklyn 999, while David grew even, getting an Emmy behind the scenes in 1998. They often show and tell stories of their dad telling everyone that, besides the cowboy hats, besides the in the first place, Dan Blocker was a father, a husband, and a man who lived with kindness in the empty house. It wasn't left alone for very long, though. The Hancock Park house might be different now. Hands, but for Dan's friends and family. The house wasn't really a home. Wood. the love he brought into every room where he laughed with his kids, and how he made sure everyone, family and friends, important.